Chosen one. They've been breathing the same air as you, but only recently did it start to feel heavier, charged, like something unseen had rewired the atmosphere. You weren't louder. You weren't seeking attention. And yet, things moved differently when you were around. People couldn't name the shift, but they felt it. The kind of presence that rewrites the rules without announcing the change. They assumed that silence meant smallness, that just because you didn't make noise, you weren't a force. What they missed was that your stillness wasn't absence. It was precision. The restraint of someone who doesn't flinch at chaos, because they've learned to bend it. You weren't performing. You were observing. And now? Now they realize they've been standing in a storm disguised as calm. What confused them most wasn't your presence, it was the way their own tactics dissolved in it. Their plans, once reliable, lost structure near you. Conversations bent, tension shifted, and nothing went the way they designed. Because they weren't dealing with an equal. They were interacting with a frequency they couldn't map, and that terrified them. The surface said peace, but underneath was something ancient and exact. A calculation running on divine timing. You weren't reacting, because your spirit had already measured the moment. You weren't moved by their triggers, not because you didn't feel, but because you knew what would happen if you ever let go fully. That quiet? It wasn't passive. It was protective, for them. They played their games, set their traps, whispered their predictions, believing they had you cornered. But while they were trying to predict your next move, you were studying their entire pattern. Not to win, but to decide if they even deserved your response. They thought you were late to the game. They didn't realize you were the one watching the board reset. And now, it's not just that they're noticing you. It's that they don't recognize the world when you're in it. Like the ecosystem changed. Like the rules updated mid-play. They're scrambling not because you attacked, but because their illusions evaporated under your presence. You didn't even touch the system. You became the variable it couldn't contain. In quiet backchannels and untraceable threads, a storm of quiet resistance began to take shape, not aimed at your appearance or your words, but at the invisible rhythm that made you unpredictable. They didn't plot against your movements, they aimed for your essence. They mapped strategies through modern screens and ancient rituals, believing they could fabricate an antidote to what they couldn't imitate. The target wasn't your habits, it was your spiritual blueprint. But what unfolded broke their framework. You don't operate on signals they recognize. What began as a covert takedown attempt evolved into an education they never asked for. The more they tried to decipher your pattern, the more their own methods turned to static. One by one, the locks they tried to pick only opened new layers of their misunderstanding. And what emerged were revelations not only about your identity, but about the scale of their miscalculation. These insights didn't arrive with explosions. They peeled away illusions like soft thunder, shaking structures while keeping you grounded. Their political maneuvering never held weight in the space you're wired for. Where they traded favors, you were granted clarity. Where they bartered influence, you embodied alignment. They didn't expect presence to win over persuasion, and that's what unraveled their plans. Connections you carry weren't manufactured through pressure or performance. They were drawn in like tides responding to a deeper lunar pull. Influence gathered around you not through strategy, but through gravity. And while they revised their methods to keep up, you simply held still, radiating a type of power that doesn't need validation. The wealth that entered your space came not through hustle, but through harmony, and it shattered every assumption about what success is supposed to look like. The first crack in their framework came camouflaged as a normal day. Invitations went missing. Initiatives you sparked were quietly transferred. Messaging change restructured to leave you out without directly excluding you. It was deliberate ambiguity designed to seed confusion, an attempt to shrink your self-trust. But instead of unraveling, your stillness became louder. Your peace didn't just remain, it expanded. They expected erosion. What they meant was expansion. The silence you responded with wasn't a lack of reaction, it was the language of someone who sees the whole room from outside its walls. While they scrambled to provoke, to rattle, to trigger, you became more precise. And what they failed to anticipate was this: when you're built from alignment, exile becomes elevation. What they tried to remove you from became irrelevant, because your orbit was never theirs to measure. Each roadblock disguised as opposition became a hidden accelerator, not tearing you down, but activating dimensions within you they never even considered. With every attempt to fracture your confidence, something ancient stirred, a quiet ignition that unlocked parts of your being they had no access to. Their tactics weren't stopping you, they were unknowingly shaping the very momentum that would carry you beyond their reach. Every slight, every strategy of doubt, triggered deeper insight into the blueprint of your own design. Then came the second distortion, a tactic less obvious, but more desperate. They reached beyond physical means, calling upon sources they barely understood, hoping to rewrite your rhythm by tampering with the unseen. Names were spoken in hushed tones during acts meant to warp your clarity, disrupt your stability, and derail the flow that followed you like a second shadow. Energy was launched in your direction, not with clarity, but confusion, all aimed to tangle the architecture of your alignment. But their aim failed to account for the origin of your foundation. This wasn't a strength built in classrooms or through clever planning, it was recognition etched into the blueprint of existence itself. The backlash came swift and silent. The very current they sent to destabilize you only reinforced the armor they couldn't see. The more they pushed, the more pronounced your light became, like someone trying to silence an echo by shouting into it. Instead of confusion, you were crowned with elevation. A new realization broke through in places they thought were mundane, in conversations cloaked as professional, in reviews disguised as neutral. The spaces around you didn't become hostile with noise, they grew tense with unspoken tension. You weren't battling people, you were operating on a wavelength that disrupted the systems built on control. They played by rules rooted in fear. You moved by a code they didn't recognize, one where growth wasn't finite and power didn't need a victim. They gathered in whispers, dissecting your moves like archaeologists trying to interpret symbols from a language they couldn't read. Each observation bled into speculation. Why does it always work out for them? Who's backing them? What are they really doing behind the scenes? They ran their data, but the numbers never matched the outcome. It always ended with the same unsettling conclusion: your results didn't make sense in their world. Because you weren't building within it, you were redefining the structure entirely. And what truly unsettled them wasn't just your ability to succeed, it was the way success expanded wherever you focused. Tasks that once felt ordinary became transformative under your stewardship. Connections that once stalled found movement. Opportunities that passed others by seemed to pause for you. Not because you chased them, but because your presence shifted the soil, and everything planted in it began to grow. You didn't take more, you became the multiplier. And they finally understood, it wasn't luck. It was law. What shook them wasn't just your advancement, it was the precision with which it unfolded despite everything they placed in your path. They watched in stunned silence as what was meant to be denied to you arrived with added weight, bigger title, more influence, deeper alignment. Their backstage interference had been meticulous, and yet the outcome mocked every step of their strategy. The initiative they tried to dismantle became the very platform that carried your name into new territory, and with it came the creeping realization that their framework couldn't contain you. Subtle games gave way to bolder plays. When backdoor moves failed, they went public, seeking to fracture your stance by sheer force of crowd and context. Remarks were sharpened and aimed at your skill, your competence, your worth. It was no longer whisper campaigns, now it was spectacle. They imagined that a public setting, amplified by numbers and ego, would crack your posture. They didn't prepare for what would happen when someone anchored in purpose stood calmly in the storm. What followed stunned even their most confident voices. The room grew unfamiliar as your response shattered their expectations. You didn't match their aggression, you dissolved it. You answered challenge with depth, criticism with clarity, insult with insight. You weren't defending a position, you were embodying a truth. And what frightened them most wasn't what you said, it was how you said it. There was something in your delivery that suggested you were informed by something beyond this moment. You carried an energy they couldn't trace, as if someone else had briefed you before the confrontation began, someone who knew their script better than they did. You weren't shaken because your understanding reached beyond the scene playing out in front of you. Their tactics landed like echoes in a room already filled with music. You didn't fight back, you understood. And that compassion? That subtle grace? It wasn't weakness. It was the mark of someone who sees their opponent's fear beneath the theater of power. That day altered the narrative. It stopped being about strategy and started being about essence. The rules they followed collapsed beside the presence you brought into the space. You weren't leveraging systems, you were rewriting them. They finally noticed that you weren't exceptional because of what you had learned, you were effective because of what you were built to withstand. Their metrics, their charts, their logic, none of it explained what they were witnessing. Because you didn't come from where they did. Every targeted moment designed to unravel you ended up unlocking a different layer of clarity. Where most would freeze or falter, you sharpened. You saw more. You knew more. You sensed what others missed. Each attempt to drag you down inadvertently lifted a veil off your vision. And every blow meant to obscure your influence only clarified its scope. You weren't just enduring, you were expanding. And they, for the first time, couldn't deny that your growth wasn't reactive. It was ordained. From that point forward, nothing returned to its original shape. You no longer occupied space in their structure, you existed above it. They tried every door, pulled every lever, but your ascent was never powered by their approval. It ran on recognition from something beyond their grasp. What they thought would silence your impact became the catalyst for your most undeniable breakthrough. And in their eyes now, wasn't just confusion. It was all wrapped in the bitter realization that they had triggered the very thing they feared. The breakthroughs they envied weren't the origin of your strength, they were merely the surface echo of something far deeper. What appeared to be convenience or favor on the outside was actually the ripple effect of something sacred and internal that had long been set in motion. Promotions weren't rewards, they were reflections. Opportunities weren't luck, they were signals that a deeper order was beginning to express itself visibly. And they couldn't grasp it, because they were only measuring what could be seen. What unfolded next revealed the limits of their strategies. When direct opposition failed, they resorted to something more collective, an effort to build alliances based not on truth, but on shared discomfort with your progress. Complaints were repackaged as concern. Whispered speculations turned into coordinated narratives. Their hope was to reshape perception through numbers, to tip the atmosphere against you by presenting your elevation as imbalance. But their assumptions were rooted in misinterpretation, and the ground beneath them was already shifting. When they began gathering voices, they expected agreement, but what returned was reflection. Instead of outrage, they encountered appreciation. People began speaking not of resentment, but of how your involvement had shifted their own experience. Small moments they hadn't previously noticed now came into focus. The calm you brought into tension, the clarity you offered in chaos, the quiet way you improved whatever you touched. The stories began to contradict the accusations. And with every retelling, the cracks in their campaign widened. Those who were initially unsure began to reconsider. A new question started to form in the minds of those they tried to recruit. What if the one they're attacking is actually holding the system together? People weren't just responding to you, they were awakening to the invisible infrastructure of harmony and precision your presence had created. And once seen, that impact couldn't be unseen. What they intended as an uprising slowly turned into a mirror. In trying to rally against you, they forced others to examine your role through an honest lens. And what became visible wasn't threat, it was elevation. Not domination, but amplification. The very group they tried to shape into resistance became the evidence of your influence. Your presence didn't create imbalance, it restored it. And that realization changed the tone of the entire room. While they were operating from scarcity, trying to reclaim space by shrinking someone else, your energy was expanding the space itself. Those around you began to recognize that the abundance flowing into your hands didn't take away from theirs, it opened pathways they didn't know existed. You weren't siphoning attention, you were revealing a model where growth wasn't a competition. And in doing so, you shifted the foundation of the entire environment. By the time they realized the misfire, it was too late. The narrative had changed. The collective had begun to resonate with the truth of your contribution. You weren't thriving at their expense. You were rising in a way that lifted others without even trying, because your success was never rooted in visibility or approval. It was the outcome of inner clarity manifesting itself, again and again, in undeniable form. The shift didn't come with noise, it came with hesitation. Where once they moved in sync, cracks appeared in their rhythm. Some began stepping back, uncomfortable with how far the sabotage had gone. Others began to sense that their perspective had been warped by envy and assumption. The whisper network that once felt powerful started sounding insecure. What had begun as a coordinated resistance was slowly becoming a collection of second thoughts and uncertain loyalties. When restraint failed, their next moves revealed something deeper, not strategy, but spiritual drought. Anonymous accusations were thrown like stones in the dark. Attempts were made to stir confusion through loopholes and falsified complaints. They fabricated conflicts and seeded mistrust into your relationships, believing if they couldn't beat you by force, they'd isolate you through deception. But in doing so, they exposed just how empty their arsenal had become. Almost immediately, those narratives began to collapse under their own weight. What was shouted in confidence one day was whispered away the next. Claims that had been spoken with boldness began to vanish behind vague excuses and blurred timelines. People who once led the charge now distanced themselves from the very claims they helped create. The bravado drained quickly once it became clear the impact was not what they had expected, but the opposite. In their panic to cover tracks, they left evidence behind like breadcrumbs. Conversations once held in secrecy surfaced through the very people who helped construct them, now desperate to avoid being blamed. Messages that were never meant to be seen found their way into open hands. Records long thought buried began to connect the dots. The schemes they thought would remain hidden forever became the very spotlight that illuminated the depths of their manipulation. But the most unexpected element was how each assault ricocheted in reverse. The accusations prompted inquiries that not only cleared your name, but revealed your integrity. The problems they tried to create forged connections with people who ended up becoming your allies. Their attempt to cloud your reputation gave you a stage to demonstrate grace and truth in ways no one could ignore. Every tactic flipped so flawlessly that it felt guided, like an unseen force was orchestrating your vindication in real time. Those closest to you didn't waver, they deepened. The attacks meant to separate you from your circle only made that circle more aware of your resilience. People watched you walk through falsehood without retaliation, through betrayal without bitterness, through pressure without collapse, and they knew they weren't following someone ordinary. The fabric of trust grew stronger, stitched together by how you handled the fire, not how you avoided it. Eventually, even the ones who opposed you the longest could no longer ignore the pattern. No matter what they threw at you, elevation followed. No matter how they tried to reduce your impact, it multiplied. Doors opened that no one even knew existed. Relationships healed stronger than before. What was meant to break you only broke their illusion of control. And then came the quiet moment of reckoning, the realization that your success never came from competing at their level, but from vibrating at a frequency they were never built to reach. And once that truth landed, their alliance didn't just fracture, it dissolved. The way the conflict fractured revealed more about you than about those who launched it. You didn't retaliate. You didn't chase vindication. You didn't campaign for attention or force people to pick sides. Instead, your silence spoke boundaries. The ones who kept throwing shade lost access to your light entirely. Those who faded into the background were met with unspoken mercy, as if history had quietly been rewritten. And the rare few who came not with defense, but with humility, found themselves gently led by someone who understood the cost of transformation. Then came the ripple. The external began to reorganize itself, not because of demand, but resonance. The environments you once entered passively now started adapting in your favor. Unbalanced energies couldn't last near you. People driven by control or resentment naturally removed themselves, not out of rejection, but incompatibility. Meanwhile, those operating with openness, depth, and growth-oriented values seemed magnetized toward your presence. The ecosystem was evolving, not because you forced it, but because you became its new gravitational center. Those who had observed from the sidelines began to behave differently. Their curiosity wasn't intellectual, it was survival instinct. They had witnessed events that defied logic and saw systems crumble against someone who never lifted a hand. Whispers turned into questions. What stabilized you? How did you know when not to speak? How did chaos unfold around you without shaking you inside? They didn't want a sermon, they wanted the blueprint behind what they had silently labeled impossible composure. Your presence became more than influential, it became instructional. Spaces quieted before you spoke. Conversations shifted when you entered. Creative flow increased around your ideas. People collaborated without coercion, sensing a higher standard in motion. Even brief moments with you felt weighty, as if clarity followed in your footsteps. The fabric of the room adjusted not because of your title, but because of the unshakable awareness you carried into it. And slowly, a new layer of purpose revealed itself. The strength that protected you was now teaching others. People began coming not just for guidance, but for a transmission, hoping to access whatever force you were clearly aligned with. They didn't just want answers, they wanted access to the inner terrain that made you move with precision through disorder. Your calm wasn't interpreted as control anymore, it was seen as mastery. Your words weren't motivation, they were codes. The expansion that followed wasn't just visible, it was structural. New ventures didn't just elevate your profile, they made room for your essence. Financial growth came from unexpected channels that honored your mission instead of draining your spirit. New alliances weren't just connections, they were soul-level collaborations prepared to support the magnitude of your next assignment. The shift wasn't simply upward, it was dimensional. You weren't fitting into better rooms, you were becoming the reason those rooms needed to be redefined. The chaos they unleashed wasn't just noise, it was instruction. When the dots began to connect across every area of attack, a new strategy emerged. No longer reacting to each issue in isolation, you decoded the map. What once looked like random interference became a blueprint for coordinated transformation. The scattered sparks of survival were collected and converted into an engine of authority. Defense became design. You stopped playing on their board and started building a new one. Every disruption they attempted became fertilizer for expansion. The fire they thought would scorch you ended up purifying what you didn't know you had inherited. Delays unearthed dormant abilities. Roadblocks uncovered hidden allies. Their pressure didn't shrink you, it speed-tracked evolution. In trying to stop your growth, they delivered you to it. What they meant for erosion became the very terrain that matured your foundation decades ahead of schedule. What surfaced wasn't a solo victory, it was a reclamation of something collective. Your rise wasn't about escaping limitation, but confronting it on behalf of many. Your breakthrough didn't close the gate behind you, it left it wide open for others who carry the same signal. Your influence began to stretch across timelines, lifting those around you not through theory but through demonstration. You became proof that ancient prayers still produce present miracles. As you ascended, everything touched by your frequency began shifting. The young carried themselves with more certainty. The unsure began to walk in clarity. Systems that had long resisted breakthrough began to open without resistance. Entire atmospheres adjusted to match the cadence of your alignment. What once moved slowly began to accelerate, not because the world changed, but because your presence taught it how to. The ones who tried to block your progress looked back with a sharp sting of realization. They hadn't just forfeited access to your favor, they'd rejected participation in a movement bigger than anything they had known. Their resistance didn't just cost you time, it cost them transformation. By aligning themselves with competition instead of calling, they opted out of something that would have blessed them simply by proximity. What had held your lineage back, silent patterns of lack, loss, and limitation, broke through you like a floodgate finally giving way. Your elevation rewrote norms that had defined entire generations. What was once considered out of reach became baseline. Leadership evolved into stewardship. Wealth began to reflect alignment, not exploitation. Relationships were no longer built on survival, but on sacred assignment. You didn't just change your life, you reprogrammed the future. They thought they were fighting a person. But what they were really challenging was a current, a surge built across bloodlines, prayers, and years of silent intercession. And when they collided with it, they didn't just lose influence, they lost illusion. You were never stepping into power, you were the embodiment of it. What they triggered wasn't just resistance, it was your full emergence. And now, the same conflict they designed to define your limits has revealed your limitless reach. What began in warfare ended in awakening, not just for you, but for every space you're called to transform next.